At 30, Charlotte had accepted the label of spinster until a letter changed everything. Her inheritance, her freedom, and even her future were at risk. One condition: marry within 6 months or lose it all. Now, she had to decide: duty or a love that might just destroy her. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Weight of 30. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving London's streets slick and grey under a September sky that promised nothing. Charlotte Kingsley stood at her drawing-room window, one hand resting against the cool glass, watching the world hurry past below. A flower seller arranged her baskets on the corner. A gentleman's carriage clattered toward Mayfair. 2 young ladies in fashionable bonnets walked arm in arm, their laughter rising faintly through the glass. Charlotte felt as though she were watching a play from the wings, close enough to observe every detail, too distant to participate. You'll catch a chill standing there in just your shawl, miss. Charlotte turned to find Mrs. Agnes Davies in the doorway, a tea tray balanced in her capable hands. At 50, Agnes was a widow with iron-grey hair, sharp hazel eyes, and a directness that had made her invaluable over the 3 years she'd served as both housekeeper and companion. "I'm perfectly warm, Agnes, though I won't refuse the tea." Mrs. Davies set the tray on the small table near the settee, her expression suggesting she knew perfectly well that Charlotte had been at that window since first light. "The post hasn't come yet, and watching for it won't make it arrive faster." "I wasn't watching for the post." Charlotte settled into her customary chair, accepting the cup Agnes handed her. "I was simply observing." "Observing life from a distance," Mrs. Davies said, not unkindly, "as you do most days." Charlotte couldn't argue with that. Her days had acquired a comfortable, numbing sameness. She woke early, read through breakfast, currently working through John Stuart Mill's essays, with more intellectual appreciation than emotional engagement. She managed her modest household accounts with the precision her father had taught her. She tended the small garden behind the townhouse, finding peace in the simple logic of pruning and planting. She read again in the afternoons, losing herself in novels where heroines had adventures Charlotte had long ago accepted she would never experience. "The quarterly income should arrive this week," Mrs. Davies said, pouring her own cup. She had long ago abandoned the pretense that she was merely a servant. Charlotte had neither the funds nor the temperament for such formality. "Mr. Whitmore's bank has always been punctual." Charlotte nodded. Her father's modest investments provided £75 per quarter, £300 per year, enough to maintain this small townhouse in an unfashionable but respectable neighbourhood. Enough for Agnes's wages, coal for the fires, modest food, and very little else. Certainly not enough for independence if her health failed or expenses increased. Not enough for security. But then, what security had ever been available to women like her? Women with small fortunes and no beauty to recommend them. Women who had somehow reached 30 without securing a husband. Women society called spinsters. "Will you attend Lady Thornton's card party on Thursday?" Mrs. Davies asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I don't believe so. I shall send regrets." "That's the 3rd invitation you've declined this month." "The invitations are merely pity, Agnes. My cousin feels obligated to include me." Charlotte set down her teacup with more force than intended. "I'd rather not subject myself to the alternative." Mrs. Davies raised an eyebrow. "The alternative?" Charlotte rose and moved to her writing desk, ostensibly to review correspondence, but truly to avoid Agnes's too knowing gaze. A cream-coloured calling card sat on the hall table nearby, and her eyes fell upon it unbidden. "Mrs. Lavinia Thornton, at home Thursdays." 2 weeks ago, Charlotte had attended her cousin's musicale. It had been a mistake. She'd known it within 5 minutes of arriving, when she'd overheard 2 debutante girls of perhaps 19, with flawless complexions and the casual cruelty of youth, whispering near the refreshment table. "Is that Miss Kingsley? I thought she'd stopped coming to events." "Poor thing. Quite on the shelf now, you know. 30 and no prospects whatsoever." 30? Heavens. Do you suppose she's given up entirely? What else can she do? It's not as though anyone will offer for her now. Charlotte had left shortly after, pleading a headache. It wasn't entirely untrue. The ache had settled behind her eyes and hadn't fully departed since. "I overheard something unpleasant," Charlotte said quietly, still facing the desk. At the musicale, it seems I have become an object of pity among the younger set. Mrs. Davies made a dismissive sound. Girls that age have pudding for brains and cruelty for wit. You're worth 10 of them, perhaps. But their judgment reflects society's, does it not? Charlotte turned back. I am 30, Agnes, unmarried, with no fortune to make my spinsterhood respectable or interesting. I am exactly what they said a woman on the shelf, past her season, past her usefulness. That's foolishness talking, is it? Be honest with me. You've been in service your entire life. You've seen how the world treats women like me. Mrs. Davies was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but truthful. I've seen society be unkind to women who don't fit its narrow expectations, yes. But I've also seen you, Miss Charlotte. I've seen your mind, your kindness, your strength. If the world can't see your value, that speaks to the world's blindness, not your worth. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. Thank you, Agnes, though I suspect we're both engaging in wishful thinking. She'd made her peace with solitude, or so she'd told herself. After her father's death 8 years ago, after the one great disappointment of her youth, she'd gradually withdrawn. It had seemed easier than enduring the marriage market's humiliations. Easier than watching younger, prettier, wealthier girls secure the matches that eluded her. Easier to embrace the label spinster than to continue pretending hope existed where none remained. Most days, she believed her own rationalizations, but sometimes, like this morning, watching life move past her window, she felt the weight of all her unlived years pressing against her chest. I'm going to sort through some of Mother's things, Charlotte said abruptly. The trunk in my bedroom. I've been meaning to do it for months. Mrs. Davies nodded, recognizing dismissal when she heard it, and left Charlotte alone. The trunk sat at the foot of Charlotte's bed, a heavy oak thing that had belonged to her mother. Charlotte knelt before it, lifting the lid to reveal carefully folded linens, a few pieces of jewelry, and her mother's wedding trousseau. The scent of lavender and old memories rose up. At the bottom, wrapped in silk, was her mother's wedding ring. Charlotte lifted it carefully. It was simple, a gold band with a small sapphire. Her father had commissioned it the year he and her mother married, when they'd had more love than money. Her mother had worn it every day until the fever took her when Charlotte was 12. Almost without thinking, Charlotte slipped the ring onto her own finger. It fit perfectly. She sat back on her heels, staring at her hand. The ring looked foreign there, a symbol of something she'd never have. She'd convinced herself she didn't want marriage, didn't want to compromise herself for a man who would control her life, her limited income, her very thoughts. But here, alone in her bedroom with her mother's ring on her finger, she could admit the truth. She didn't want marriage as society prescribed it. But partnership? Companionship? Someone who saw her, truly saw her, and chose her anyway? That longing lived in her still, buried beneath layers of pragmatism and protective cynicism. Charlotte pulled off the ring and wrapped it back in silk, closing the trunk with a decisive thud. Enough melancholy, enough yearning for impossible things. She had her books, her garden, her comfortable routine. It was enough. It had to be. The knocker sounded downstairs, the afternoon post. Charlotte descended to find Mrs. Davies already at the door, accepting a packet from the postman. Among the usual correspondence was a letter that made Agnes's eyebrows rise. This one's for you, miss. Fancy seal. Charlotte took the envelope. Heavy paper. Black wax seal impressed with an ornate letter H. The handwriting was unfamiliar, masculine, precise. Miss Charlotte Kingsley. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, aware of Agnes watching with unconcealed curiosity. The letter was brief. Miss Kingsley. It is my duty to inform you of the death of Miss Helena Margaret Kingsley, late of Moorfield House, Derbyshire. As her sole surviving niece, you are requested to attend the reading of her will at the offices of Pemberton and Associates, Gray's Inn, London, at your earliest convenience. Please contact this office to arrange an appointment. Yours faithfully, Ache, Pemberton, Solicitor. Charlotte read it twice, trying to make sense of the words. Aunt Helena, dead. She'd met Helena only once, as a child, a tall, elegant woman with sad eyes who'd brought Charlotte a book of poetry and left the same afternoon. Her father had mentioned Helena occasionally, always with a mixture of pity and disapproval. My sister chose pride over happiness, he'd said once. She's been alone ever since. Miss Charlotte? Agnes's voice seemed to come from very far away. What is it? Charlotte looked up. the letter trembling in her hand. My Aunt Helena has died. I'm to attend the reading of her will. Helena Kingsley? The one who left London decades ago? The same. Mercy. Mrs. Davies moved closer. You never spoke of her. I barely knew her. I didn't realize she'd kept track of me at all. Charlotte stared at the letter, her mind racing. Why would Helena remember her in a will? They'd been strangers. I should write to Mr. Pemberton, arrange the appointment. But she didn't move. She stood in her narrow hallway, holding a letter that smelled of old paper and legal dust, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Outside her window, London continued its indifferent bustle. Inside, Charlotte felt the first tremor of something she'd thought long dead. Change was coming. She could feel it, and she couldn't decide if she was terrified or relieved. Chapter 2. The Impossible Condition. 2 days later, Charlotte found herself in a hackney cab, rattling through London's legal quarter, clutching her reticule as though it might anchor her to reality. Mrs. Davies had insisted on accompanying her, though Charlotte had initially protested. You're not walking into a solicitor's office alone to hear what some dead relative has left you, Agnes had said firmly. It's not proper, and besides, you'll want someone sensible nearby when the news comes, whatever it may be. Now, watching the grey buildings of Gray's Inn slide past the window, Charlotte was grateful for the companionship. Your aunt was a mystery, miss, Mrs. Davies said quietly, as if reading Charlotte's thoughts. Left London 30 years ago after some scandal. Never married, never returned. My own mother said she'd been beautiful and brilliant, but proud. Charlotte turned from the window. Your mother knew her? Knew of her? Everyone did, briefly. Helena Kingsley was quite the sensation. One season, beautiful, clever, spirited. Then something happened. Mother never knew exactly what, but Helena disappeared to the country and was never seen in society again. Agnes paused. Funny how women get called proud when they refuse to bend. The hackney stopped before a narrow building wedged between larger, more prosperous-looking establishments. A brass plaque read, Pemberton and Associates, Solicitors. The interior smelled of old paper, leather, and dust. A thin clerk with ink-stained fingers led them up a cramped staircase to a first-floor office, where Mr. Pemberton waited. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and spectacles perched on a thin nose. His clothing was as precise as his posture. Everything about him suggested a man who dealt in exactitudes, not ambiguities. Miss Kingsley. He rose and bowed slightly. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. Charlotte settled into a chair opposite his desk, Mrs. Davies taking a seat slightly behind her. The office was crowded with filing cabinets and shelves, groaning under the weight of legal volumes. A single window overlooked the courtyard below. I shall be direct, Mr. Pemberton said, adjusting his spectacles. Your aunt, Miss Helena Kingsley, died on the 8th of September at her estate, Moorfield House, in Derbyshire. She was 68 years old. You are her sole surviving niece and the primary beneficiary of her will. Charlotte's heart began to beat faster. I barely knew my aunt, Mr. Pemberton. I met her only once, when I was a child. Nevertheless, she remembered you well. She spoke of you frequently in recent years. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. The estate is substantial. Moorfield House itself, a manor house with approximately 40 rooms, outbuildings, and 120 acres of land. There are also investments managed by Courts and Company, yielding approximately £800 per annum. Securities and savings amount to approximately £15,000. The room seemed to tilt. Charlotte gripped the arms of her chair. £800 per year, £15,000 in capital, the townhouse, the land, everything. It was more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. More than security, it was freedom, complete, absolute freedom. There is, however, a condition, Mr. Pemberton continued, his tone carefully neutral. Of course there was. Charlotte forced herself to breathe evenly. What condition? You must marry within 6 months of your aunt's death. The marriage must be legally binding and, in the judgment of the executor, entered into in good faith. Should you fail to meet this condition by March 15th, 1876, the entire estate passes to your cousin, Mr. Reginald Kingsley of Yorkshire. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock through Charlotte's mind. Marry. The word came out strangled. She's requiring me to marry. Within 6 months. Yes. Charlotte stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is unconscionable. My aunt, a woman I barely knew, seeks to control my life from beyond the grave, to force me into marriage like some medieval chattel." Mr. Pemberton remained infuriatingly calm. "Miss Kingsley, I understand your distress. Do you? Do you understand what it means to be a woman of 30, with no fortune, no prospects, and society's judgment hanging over you like a sword? And now, when some measure of security finally arrives, it comes with a chain attached." Charlotte's voice shook with fury. "I have spent years refusing to marry simply for the sake of marriage. I will not be manipulated into it, even by a generous inheritance." "If I may finish," Pemberton said gently, "the condition is not as straightforward as you believe." Charlotte remained standing, breathing hard. "Your aunt appointed an executor with full authority to determine whether the marriage condition has been met in spirit and in truth." Those were her exact words. "The executor must certify that any marriage is genuine, entered into willingly, and not merely a legal arrangement to secure the inheritance." "And who is this executor?" "Duke Alexander Hawthorne. His Grace's estate borders Moorfield. He was your aunt's neighbor and, in recent years, her closest friend. She trusted his judgment absolutely." "A duke, of course." Charlotte sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "So I must not only marry within 6 months, but convince a duke, a stranger, that my marriage is genuine? His Grace is a man of integrity and insight, according to your aunt. She believed he would ensure the spirit of her wishes was honored, not merely the letter." "And what were her wishes, Mr. Pemberton? Why would she do this?" The solicitor hesitated, then reached into his portfolio again. "She left you a letter, Miss Kingsley, to be delivered by His Grace personally. She insisted he be the one to give it to you, after you'd had time to consider the terms." Charlotte stared at the portfolio as though it contained a serpent. "When can I meet this Duke Hawthorne?" "I shall write to him today. He divides his time between London and Derbyshire. I believe he's currently in town." Pemberton's expression softened slightly. "Miss Kingsley, your aunt was not a cruel woman. Eccentric, perhaps. Wounded, certainly, but not cruel. I believe when you read her letter, you may better understand her motives." Charlotte said nothing. Her mind was spinning through calculations, possibilities, implications. £800 per year would give her independence she'd never dreamed of. She could live comfortably, travel if she wished, support causes she believed in. She could be more than a poor relation surviving on the edges of society. She could be herself, fully and freely. But marriage, to achieve that freedom, she would have to surrender the very thing she'd protected for 10 years, her right to choose her own path. "It is September 20th, Mr. Pemberton said quietly. "You have 5 months and 25 days, Miss Kingsley. I suggest you consider your options carefully." Outside, the afternoon had grown colder. Charlotte walked blindly, Mrs. Davies beside her, barely aware of the streets passing beneath her feet. £800 per year, Agnes said finally. "That's more than most gentlewomen see in a lifetime." "I know. You could live independently, keep your own household, never depend on anyone's charity or tolerance again." "I know. But you'd have to marry." "Yes." Charlotte stopped walking, turned to face her companion. "Agnes, I've spent years refusing to marry for convenience, for security, for all the practical reasons women are told they must marry. How is this any different? If I marry now, even if I choose someone decent, won't I always wonder if I did it for the money? Won't everyone else know that I did?" Mrs. Davies studied her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Perhaps. Or perhaps your aunt is giving you something else, the means to choose freely. With that inheritance, you could marry for love. If love came, you wouldn't need the marriage for security. You'd have security already." Charlotte wanted to laugh at the naivety of it, but something in Agnes's words caught at her. The inheritance wouldn't trap her. The condition might force a choice, but the money itself would free her from ever having to marry for necessity again. If she could satisfy the condition once, she'd be free forever. "I need to meet this Duke," Charlotte said. "I need to understand what my aunt truly wanted and what power this man holds over my future. And then I shall decide if my pride is worth more than my independence." Charlotte resumed walking, her stride more purposeful now. "I have 5 months and 25 days. Let us see what can be accomplished with a deadline and a fortune hanging in the balance." But as they walked through London's greying streets, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that her aunt, a woman she'd barely known, had seen something in her that she'd never seen in herself. Something worth saving, or something worth challenging. She wasn't yet certain which frightened her more. Chapter 3. The Duke's Estate. Hawthorne House rose before Charlotte like a monument to everything she was not powerful, imposing, utterly certain of its place in the world. The London residence of the Duke of Hawthorne occupied an entire corner of Grosvenor Square, its Portland stone facade gleaming even under September's grey skies. Charlotte stood on the pavement, suddenly aware of every thread in her modest day dress, every scuff on her boots. "The Duke of Hawthorne," Mrs. Davies muttered beside her. "Your aunt certainly moved in elevated circles toward the end. Or perhaps she simply knew her neighbour." Charlotte straightened her spine. A title didn't make a man infallible. She'd known lords who couldn't balance their own accounts and dukes who couldn't string together a coherent thought. "He's merely a man, Agnes. One who happens to hold my future in his hands. That's what concerns me." A footman answered their knock, his livery so pristine Charlotte wondered if he'd been hired for decorative purposes. He led them through an entrance hall that could have swallowed Charlotte's entire townhouse black and white marble floors, a chandelier that must have held 100 candles, portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilt frames. But instead of leading them to a formal study, the footman turned down a glass-walled corridor toward the back of the house. "His Grace is in the conservatory, miss. He asks that you join him there." The conservatory was a revelation of light and green after the formal grandeur of the entrance. Glass panels formed an arched ceiling, allowing weak autumn sun to filter through. The air was warm, humid, heavy with the scent of earth and growing things. Ferns cascaded from hanging baskets. Exotic plants Charlotte couldn't name filled every available surface, and in the center of it all, examining an orchid with evident concentration, was Duke Alexander Hawthorne. Charlotte's first thought was that he looked nothing like a duke, or at least not like the pampered aristocrats she'd observed at a distance. He was tall and lean rather than portly, dressed in charcoal grey that suggested expensive tailoring worn without vanity. Dark hair showed grey at the temples, though he couldn't be much past 35. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, a mouth that looked as though it rarely smiled. But it was his hands that surprised her most. They were in the soil, gently examining the orchid's roots, and they were stained with dirt. He looked up as they approached, and Charlotte found herself meeting eyes the colour of steel, assessing, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. "Miss Kingsley," he straightened, setting down the plant with care. "Thank you for coming." He glanced at his hands, then at a nearby basin. "Forgive me. I lose track of propriety when I'm working." "There's nothing to forgive in honest work, Your Grace." Something flickered in those grey eyes, approval perhaps, or surprise. He washed his hands efficiently and dried them on a linen towel before turning his full attention to her. "May I offer my condolences on the loss of your aunt? Helena was a remarkable woman. I shall miss her greatly." The words were formal, but the feeling behind them was genuine. Charlotte heard it in the slight catch in his voice, saw it in the way his expression softened. "Thank you, Your Grace. Though I confess I barely knew her. Mr. Pemberton mentioned you were close." "Helena was my mother's dearest friend. When my mother died 10 years ago, Helena became," he paused, choosing words carefully, "a maternal presence. Someone who spoke truth rather than flattery, who cared more for my character than my title. That must have been rare." "Exceedingly." He gestured to a small seating area beneath a sprawling fern. "Please, sit. Mrs. Davies, there's a comfortable chair just there, if you'd care for tea. I'll have some scent." Mrs. Davies settled herself within sight, but out of immediate earshot, proper chaperonage, without intrusion. A servant appeared with remarkable speed, bearing a tea service. Once they were settled, Alexander regarded Charlotte with that same assessing gaze. "Helena spoke of you often in her final year. She called you the girl with my spirit, but hopefully more courage." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She didn't know me well enough to judge my courage or lack thereof. She knew enough. She read your letters to your father before his death. She attended that lecture at the Royal Society where you asked the visiting professor about evolutionary adaptation in domestic plants. At Charlotte's look of shock, he added, "She kept track of you, Miss Kingsley, from a distance, but with great attention." Charlotte didn't know what to say to that. The idea of her reclusive aunt watching her life from afar was both touching and unsettling. Alexander withdrew an envelope from his jacket. "She left this for you. I was instructed to deliver it personally." Charlotte took the letter with trembling fingers. The paper was fine, the handwriting elegant and feminine. She started to tuck it away. You needn't read it privately on my account, Alexander said quietly. Helena trusted me with her thoughts. I suspect this contains nothing I don't already know. Charlotte hesitated, then broke the seal. My dear Charlotte, if you are reading this, I have failed to find the courage in life that I hope to give you in death. 30 years ago, I loved a man, a good man, a gentleman's steward, with more honor than any lord I knew. My family forbade it. He was beneath my station, they said. I would be ruined, they said. I chose pride over love. I chose security over risk. I chose loneliness over scandal. And I have been alone ever since. I watched you from afar these years, saw you retreat as I did, saw you build walls against disappointment and call it dignity. I recognized myself in you, child, and it broke my heart. This inheritance is not a prison, but a key. The condition forces you to face the question I never dared answer. What life do you truly want? Not what life seems safe, or proper, or least painful. What life would make you feel alive? The executor I have chosen will ensure you marry only if you wish it, only for genuine feeling. He will not be deceived by convenience or bribed by desperation. Trust him. He understands the cost of living half a life. Be braver than I was, Charlotte. Choose love if it comes. Choose passion if it calls. Choose yourself, fully and without apology. Your loving aunt, H.K. Charlotte read it twice, her vision blurring. When she finally looked up, Alexander was studying his orchids, giving her privacy while remaining present. She loved someone, Charlotte said, her voice rough, and chose security instead. Thomas Bright, her father's steward. Alexander turned back to her. She told me the whole story one evening when she was very ill. She said it was the only real choice she'd ever faced, and she'd chosen wrongly. How do you know she chose wrongly? Perhaps marrying him would have brought different regrets. Perhaps. But she spent 30 years alone, wondering. That seemed regret enough. Charlotte folded the letter carefully. Mr. Pemberton said you have full authority to judge whether any marriage I make is genuine. Yes. And what qualifies you to judge genuine feeling, Your Grace? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and contained. I was engaged once, Miss Kingsley, to a suitable young woman of impeccable breeding. She died of fever before our wedding. He met Charlotte's eyes directly. And my primary feeling was relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to spend my life pretending affection I didn't feel, playing a role that had been written for me before I was old enough to question it. The honesty in his admission stole Charlotte's breath. So yes, he continued, I know what genuine feeling looks like, because I know what it looks like to live without it. Charlotte found herself studying him with new attention. Not just a duke, not just Helena's executor, but a man who'd lived inside duty's constraints and recognized them for the prison they were. What do you propose, Your Grace? Alexander, please, we'll be spending considerable time together over the coming months. Formality will become tedious. Alexander, then, and I'm Charlotte. She straightened. What's your plan? Not to parade you before every bachelor in London like livestock at market. He moved to the orchid he'd been examining, touched one delicate petal with surprising gentleness. These orchids, do you know anything about them? Very little. They're extraordinary survivors. They adapt to the most inhospitable environments, but they can't be forced. Try to make them grow where they don't wish to, and they'll simply die. He looked at her. I won't force you toward anyone, Charlotte. Instead, I'll reintroduce you to society gradually. We'll spend time together so I might honestly assess any potential match you find, and you'll visit Moorfield, your inheritance. You should see what you stand to gain or lose. You'd escort me to Derbyshire. My estate borders yours. It's perfectly practical. A pause. And I confess, I'm curious to see if we can have a civilized conversation about Darwin. The matrons of the ton find evolutionary theory distressingly unladylike. Charlotte felt the first genuine smile in days tug at her mouth. You've read On the Origin of Species? Twice. You? 3 times. Though I found his later work on orchid pollination equally fascinating. Alexander's expression transformed not quite a smile, but something warmer than his previous reserve. We leave for Derbyshire in 1 week, October 1st. That gives you 5 months from that point, Charlotte. Let us not waste them. Charlotte stood, extending her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Alexander took it. His grip was firm, warm, calloused from working with soil and plants. Very well, Your Grace, Alexander. Let's see what can be accomplished with a deadline and an impossible condition. As she left the conservatory, Charlotte glanced back once. Alexander had returned to his orchids, but he was watching her go, his expression thoughtful. For the first time since receiving her aunt's letter, Charlotte felt something other than anger or fear. She felt curious, and perhaps, just perhaps, a whisper of hope. Chapter 4. Echoes from the Past. The trunk arrived on a grey Thursday morning, delivered by two sweating men who complained about the weight as they hauled it up Charlotte's narrow stairs. It was larger than she'd expected, heavy oak bound with brass, scarred by decades of use. "Your aunt's personal effects, miss," the lead carter said, handing her the delivery receipt. "From Moorfield House, Derbyshire." After they'd gone, Charlotte stood in her drawing room, staring at the trunk as though it might open of its own accord and reveal its secrets. "Well," Mrs. Davies said finally, "it won't unpack itself." Together they knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The scent hit Charlotte first, lavender and old paper, the particular mustiness of things long stored. Inside lay a lifetime of carefully preserved memories. Journals bound in leather, their spines cracked with age, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a collection of pressed flowers, each labelled in precise handwriting with dates and Latin names, books with annotations in the margins, and at the very top, wrapped in silk, a miniature portrait. Charlotte lifted it carefully. The painting showed a young woman of perhaps 22, beautiful in an unconventional way, with dark hair, intelligent eyes, and a slight smile that suggested she knew something amusing that the painter did not. "That's Helena," Mrs. Davies breathed. "Heavens, miss, you have her eyes." Charlotte studied the portrait more closely. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same dark brows, the same determined jaw, the same expression of contained intensity. "I never realized," Charlotte murmured. She set the portrait aside and reached for the journals, selecting the oldest. The first entry was dated 1845, written in an eager, youthful hand. "June 3rd, 1845. Father has announced my engagement to Baron Edward Fulbright. Mother is beside herself with joy. The settlement is generous, the match advantageous. I should be pleased. I find I am merely resigned." Charlotte read on, tracing Helena's life through ink and paper. The entries painted a picture of a young woman going through the motions of an expected life, dress fittings, social calls, dutiful letters to her intended. And then, 3 months later, September 8th, 1845, met father's new steward today, Thomas Bright, a gentleman's son, fallen on difficult times, but educated, articulate. He spoke of crop rotation with more passion than Edward has shown for anything. Edward speaks of horses and hunting. Thomas speaks of soil science and sustainable yields. Dangerous thoughts. I must not think them. But of course, she had thought them. The subsequent entries documented Helena's growing fascination, despite her efforts to suppress it. September 20th. Encountered Mr. Bright in the library. He was reading Wordsworth. We discussed the romantic poets for an hour. I forgot myself entirely. This must stop. October 2nd. It hasn't stopped. We meet by accident. That is not accident. We talk of everything: philosophy, science, poetry, politics. With Edward, I am ornamental. With Thomas, I am alive. November 15th. He kissed me today in the rose garden. I should have stopped him. I kissed him back instead. What am I doing? What am I becoming? Charlotte read faster, her heart aching for the young woman whose words grew increasingly anguished. Helena and Thomas had carried on a secret relationship for months, meetings in the library, walks in the garden, stolen moments of connection that became the center of Helena's existence, until her family discovered them. February 3rd, 1846. Father knows. Someone saw us. He summoned Thomas, dismissed him on the spot, threatened to ruin him utterly to ensure he never finds employment again, to destroy his family's remaining prospects. Then father came to me. He gave me a choice: marry Edward as planned, or watch Thomas destroyed. He said, if I truly loved Thomas, I would protect him by letting him go. February 4th. I told Thomas we cannot see each other again. I said I'd been foolish, that I'd never meant anything serious. The look on his face. I shall see that look until I die. February 7th. I have broken my engagement to Edward. I cannot marry him now, but neither can I have Thomas. Father has made that impossible. I choose neither. I choose nothing. Perhaps that is its own form of courage. Or its own form of cowardice, Charlotte whispered. Mrs. Davies, reading over her shoulder, made a soft sound of sympathy. The later journals documented 30 years of quiet withdrawal. Helena had left London, retreated to Moorfield, created a life of books and gardens and careful solitude, and through it all, occasional glimpses of Thomas Bright. May 1851 saw Thomas in the village today. He is employed as steward at Thornbury Hall now, doing well by all accounts. We nodded politely. He looks older. I suppose I do as well. December 1860. 15 years. Thomas remains unmarried. I wonder if that brings me comfort or additional guilt. April 1870. Thomas's hair is grey now, as is mine. We still nod when we pass. Sometimes I think I see regret in his eyes. Sometimes I fear it's a mirror. At the bottom of the trunk, Charlotte found a separate bundle of letters with a note attached in Helena's hand. Thomas's letters to me, found among his effects after his death, 1870. Never sent, never received, never forgotten. Charlotte's hands trembled as she opened the first. My dearest Helena, I know I shouldn't write this. I know you'll never receive it. But I must put these words somewhere or go mad. Letter after letter documented Thomas's enduring love, his understanding of Helena's choice, his inability to move forward. He'd never married, never stopped loving her, and she'd never known. Merciful heavens, Mrs. Davies said quietly. 30 years they both spent alone, each protecting the other from a scandal that would have mattered to no one but themselves in the end. Charlotte looked up, surprised by the emotion in Agnes's voice. Mrs. Davies settled heavily in a nearby chair. I married for security at 19, miss. Tom Davies was 15 years older, steady, reliable. He offered safety when my family had none. I respected him. I bore him a son, who died in infancy. Tom died 10 years later, and she paused. I don't regret my choice. Tom was good to me. But I envy those who had a choice made with their whole heart. Who knew what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, by another person. Charlotte reached over and squeezed Agnes's hand. On October 1st, Charlotte, Mrs. Davies, and Alexander departed London by train. The journey north took most of the day, the landscape gradually transforming from urban sprawl to rolling countryside. Alexander had secured a private compartment. As the miles passed, Charlotte found herself sharing Helena's story, the journals, the letters, the 30 years of quiet regret. Alexander listened with the same focused attention she'd noticed in the conservatory, saying little but absorbing everything. I had a similar revelation, he said finally, as the Derbyshire hills came into view. When Lady Cecilia died, I waited for grief. It never came. Only relief that I wouldn't have to spend my life pretending. I knew then I'd been playing a role written by expectation rather than choice. Did you love her at all? I liked her. I wished her well. But love? No. I'm not certain I knew what that word meant then. He looked out at the passing landscape. Helena tried to teach me. She said love wasn't safety or convenience. It was recognition. Seeing someone's true self and choosing them anyway, choosing them because of what you see, not despite it. The train pulled into the station as afternoon faded toward evening. A carriage waited to take them the final miles to Moorfield House. Charlotte's first glimpse of her inheritance stole her breath. Moorfield House rose from its gardens like something from a painting, golden stone glowing in the late sun, mullioned windows reflecting the sky, ivy climbing the walls in elegant chaos. It was beautiful, slightly neglected, surrounded by gardens that had been carefully planned, but allowed to grow somewhat wild. It's extraordinary, Charlotte breathed. Helena loved it dearly, Alexander said. She found more peace here than anywhere else. Inside, dust covers shrouded furniture. A long-time housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, showed them through rooms that smelled of disuse and old memories. Helena's bedroom remained untouched, preserved exactly as she'd left it. More journals lay on the bedside table. A landscape painting hung on the wall, ordinary at first glance. But when Charlotte lifted the frame, she found another painting hidden behind it. A portrait of a young man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, written on the back, Thomas Bright, 1846. She looked at him every day, Charlotte whispered, for 30 years. In the final journal entry, dated just a week before Helena's death, Charlotte found her answer. September 1st, 1875. Charlotte is 30 now, the age I was when I made my choice. The age when I chose fear over courage, security over love, loneliness over scandal. I have given her means the inheritance. I have given her motive the condition. Alexander will give her protection and wisdom. Heaven grant her the courage I lacked. Grant her the strength to choose life over safety. I would give anything to have those years back, to make a different choice, but I cannot. I can only hope she will be braver than I was. Charlotte stood in Helena's bedroom as twilight gathered, holding that final journal entry, tears streaming silently down her face. Alexander appeared in the doorway but said nothing, simply stood witness to her grief. Finally, Charlotte walked outside into Helena's garden. The autumn evening was cool, the sky deepening to purple. Alexander followed at a respectful distance. She wasted 30 years, Charlotte said. 30 years alone because she was afraid, or she protected the man she loved from ruin. Or she was simply afraid and dressed her fear as sacrifice. Charlotte turned to face him. I won't do that. I won't spend 30 years wondering what if. Whatever choice I make, it will be deliberate. Even if society condemns it, especially then. Alexander studied her in the fading light, and Charlotte thought she saw something in his expression, approval, perhaps, or recognition. Then we understand each other, he said quietly. They stood together in silence as darkness fell, two people determined not to repeat the past's mistakes, neither yet brave enough to imagine what that might mean. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Affection Past. Charlotte stood before the mirror in Helena's bedroom, now her bedroom, and barely recognized herself. The gown Mrs. Davies had refashioned from Helena's wardrobe was deep blue silk, the color of twilight. It fit as though made for her, which perhaps it had been. She and Helena shared the same slender build, the same height. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves fashionably narrow, the skirt falling in graceful folds that whispered when she moved. "You look beautiful, miss," Mrs. Davies said, securing the final pin in Charlotte's upswept hair. "Your aunt would be pleased." Charlotte touched the silk uncertainly. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume. You're wearing confidence. There's a difference." Agnes met her eyes in the mirror. "The Duke arranged this ball to reintroduce you to society. Show them Helena's niece is worth knowing. Or show them I'm desperately seeking a husband to secure my inheritance. Let them think what they wish. You know the truth." But what was the truth? Charlotte wondered as the carriage arrived. That she had 4 months left to find someone suitable? That she was attending a ball in a dead woman's dress, hoping to accomplish what her aunt never could? The sound of boots on gravel drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Alexander stepping down from his carriage, and her breath caught. He wore formal evening clothes, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, pristine cravat, with the unconscious elegance of someone who'd been dressing for such occasions since childhood. But it was his expression when he entered the drawing room and saw her that made Charlotte's heart stutter. He stopped mid-step. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, his lips parted as though to speak, and for one unguarded moment, Charlotte saw something raw in his face, something that looked almost like longing. Then his expression smoothed, controlled once more. "Miss Kingsley, you look, well, that color suits you." Such carefully neutral words, but Charlotte had seen what lay beneath them. "Thank you, Your Grace. Shall we?" Lord Hadley's estate blazed with light, music spilling from open windows into the October night. Charlotte's anxiety increased with each step toward the ballroom. The moment they entered, conversations faltered, heads turned. Charlotte felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her. Helena's niece, the inheritance, unmarried, at 30. The whispers weren't cruel, not like London, but they were curious, speculative. Charlotte lifted her chin and kept her expression serene, years of practice serving her well. Alexander's hand settled briefly at the small of her back, a gesture of support that steadied her. "Come, I'll introduce you properly." He moved through the room with quiet authority, introducing Charlotte to local gentry with a manner that commanded respect. Sir Robert and Lady Harrison. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, the Reverend Thompson and his wife. Each responded to Alexander's regard with warmth, extending that courtesy to Charlotte by association. Gradually, Charlotte's shoulders relaxed. These were country folk, less concerned with London's rigid hierarchies. They spoke of Helena with genuine fondness, welcoming Charlotte as her heir. She was almost enjoying herself when she saw him. Across the room, near the refreshment table, stood James Westwood. The world tilted. 8 years collapsed into nothing. He was still handsome, perhaps more so, maturity adding character to features that had been merely pretty in youth. Honey-colored hair, warm brown eyes, the kind of smile that made people instinctively smile back. He wore evening clothes well, though they lacked the expensive perfection of Alexander's tailoring. And he was looking directly at her, his expression shifting from surprise to something more complicated. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't thought of James in years, or rather, she'd thought of him only as a cautionary tale, a reminder of her own foolishness. But seeing him now unleashed memories she'd buried. Summer, 1867. Charlotte at 22, still raw from her father's death the year before. James appearing at a garden party, all charm and poetry, paying attention to the quiet girl everyone else overlooked. Weeks of courtship walks in Hyde Park, conversations about literature, stolen glances across drawing rooms, Charlotte falling in love for the first time, believing herself loved in return. Then Lady Millicent Harding arriving for the season, beautiful, wealthy, everything Charlotte wasn't. James's attentions shifting overnight like a weather vane in a storm. The humiliation of watching him court Millicent with the same poetry, the same devoted looks. The announcement of their engagement 3 months later, Charlotte's heart breaking quietly, privately, as hearts of women like her always broke. James was approaching now, weaving through the crowd with apparent determination. "Miss Kingsley," he bowed, "I had no idea you were in Derbyshire. What an unexpected pleasure." Charlotte's voice came out cooler than she'd intended. "Mr. Westwood, I might say the same. There are no words for how I conducted myself 8 years ago." His expression was earnest, pained. "I was young, stupid, and far too concerned with security over substance. I've regretted it ever since." "Then perhaps we should not search for words, Mr. Westwood. The past is best left there." But he persisted, lowering his voice. "I heard about your aunt's passing, and the inheritance. You must be overwhelmed. If there's anything I can do, any way I might be of service." "That's very kind, but unnecessary." He glanced past her shoulder, and his demeanor shifted subtly, became more deferential. Charlotte turned to find Alexander at her elbow, his expression politely neutral but his grey eyes hard. "Your Grace." James bowed more deeply. "I was just offering my condolences to Miss Kingsley on her loss." "How thoughtful." Alexander's tone could have frozen water. "Westwood, isn't it? I believe you're renting Ashford Lodge." "Yes, Your Grace, for the past 6 months." The two men studied each other, James with careful deference, Alexander with aristocratic assessment. Charlotte felt the tension crackling between them. "Mr. Westwood was just leaving," Charlotte said firmly. But James shook his head. "Actually, Miss Kingsley, I was hoping we might speak privately, just briefly. I promise not to monopolize your evening." Charlotte should have refused. Every instinct screamed refusal. But she was aware of Alexander watching, aware of the old wound in her chest that had never quite healed, aware of a traitorous curiosity about what James wanted to say. "A brief walk on the terrace, that's all." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." The terrace was cool after the ballroom's warmth. Paper lanterns cast pools of amber light across the flagstones. James kept a respectful distance, but his eyes held an intensity that unsettled her. "I was widowed 3 years ago," he said without preamble. "Millicent died in childbirth, the child as well, a daughter." Charlotte felt genuine sympathy pierce her carefully maintained indifference. "I'm very sorry." "It was." He paused, pain flickering across his face. "It was a terrible marriage, Charlotte. May I call you Charlotte? We knew each other well once." "Miss Kingsley, please." He nodded, accepting the rebuke. "The marriage was terrible despite Millicent's fortune. Perhaps because of it. She knew I'd married her for money. I knew she'd married me to spite another suitor. We made each other miserable." His voice dropped. "I chose security, Miss Kingsley, and I lost everything that mattered. I think of what might have been had I been brave enough to choose differently." "You mean, had you been brave enough to choose a girl with no fortune?" "I mean, had I been brave enough to choose love over practicality?" He took a step closer. "I made a mistake 8 years ago, the worst mistake of my life. I've thought of you often, wondered what became of you, and now, here you are." Charlotte's throat tightened. She wanted to be unmoved, but the raw honesty in his voice stirred something pity, perhaps, or the echo of old affection. She noticed he kept glancing at his pocket watch, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his earnest declarations. "I should return inside," she said. "May I call on you?" At Moorfield, I'd like the chance to know you again, to prove I've changed. Against her better judgment, Charlotte heard herself say, tea, Thursday afternoon. James's smile was brilliant, transforming his face. Thank you. You won't regret it. As they turned to go inside, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His timing felt too perfect to be coincidental. Everything well, Miss Kingsley? Perfectly, Your Grace. The carriage ride back to Moorfield was silent. Charlotte stared out the window at darkness, aware of Alexander's presence beside her, aware of questions unasked. Finally, do you know Mr. Westwood well? Charlotte considered lying, then rejected it. We were acquainted 8 years ago in London. He courted me briefly, then married an heiress. I see. A pause. He's been in the county 6 months, renting Ashford Lodge. So he said. Charlotte. Alexander stopped, seeming to struggle with something. Then, carefully, you're free to see whomever you wish. I'm merely the executor, not your keeper. But what? Be careful. Such simple words, but they carried weight, warning, concern, and something else Charlotte couldn't quite name. That night, alone in her room, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, looking toward the lights of Hawthorne Park, visible through the trees. James Westwood, the ghost of her 22-year-old self's romantic dreams. He'd seemed genuinely regretful, genuinely changed by grief and experience. But it was Alexander's face she kept seeing, the moment he'd looked at her in the blue dress, the controlled tension when James approached, the careful neutrality of his warning. She'd wanted him to object, Charlotte realized with uncomfortable clarity. She'd wanted Alexander to protest, to claim some right to her choices, which was foolish, dangerous, impossible. He was helping her fulfill her aunt's condition, nothing more. His concern was professional duty, not personal interest. But as Charlotte finally climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the memory of that unguarded moment when Alexander had first seen her, the look in his eyes before he'd hidden it away. The look that had seemed, for just one heartbeat, like hunger. Chapter 6. Competing Attentions. James Westwood arrived precisely at 3 o'clock on Thursday, carrying an elaborate bouquet of hothouse roses that must have cost more than Charlotte spent on flowers in a year. Miss Kingsley, he bowed with practiced elegance. Thank you for receiving me. These pale in comparison to your own beauty, but I hoped they might brighten your day. Charlotte accepted the flowers with polite thanks, noting Mrs. Davies's expression of profound skepticism as she took them away. Agnes returned moments later with tea service, positioning herself with needlework by the window close enough to chaperone, far enough to suggest privacy. James settled into the chair opposite Charlotte, immediately at ease in a way that felt both natural and performed. Moorfield is even lovelier in daylight. You must be overwhelmed, inheriting such an estate. It's been an adjustment. I imagine so. Going from modest circumstances to, he gestured at the elegant drawing room, this must feel like a dream. There was something in his tone not quite condescending, but close, as though he were congratulating a child on unexpected good fortune. Helena left me more than property, Charlotte said carefully. She left me responsibility. Of course, of course. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. I've been thinking about our conversation at the ball, about mistakes and second chances. Charlotte, Miss Kingsley, I wasn't entirely honest about my circumstances. Oh? Millicent's family retained most of the fortune when she died. Naturally, given the nature of our marriage. He looked away, apparently embarrassed. I have a modest income, enough to maintain appearances, but nothing substantial. I mention this only because I want no misunderstanding between us. I'm not a wealthy man. Charlotte wondered why he felt compelled to establish this. I appreciate your candor. Helena's estate is beautiful, he continued, his tone shifting to something more casual. The house alone must be worth a considerable sum, and I understand there are investments as well. You must be relieved to have such security. There it was, the real subject of interest. Charlotte sipped her tea, studying him over the rim of her cup. The inheritance comes with conditions, as I'm sure you've heard. The marriage requirement? Yes, the whole county knows. James smiled sympathetically. Dreadfully old-fashioned of your aunt, if you'll forgive me saying so, though I suppose she had her reasons. She did. James launched into reminiscences of their time in London, romanticized versions of events Charlotte remembered quite differently. He spoke of his unhappy marriage with Millicent, his isolation since her death, his regret over choosing security over authentic connection. It was a compelling performance. Charlotte might have believed it entirely if he hadn't kept steering the conversation back to Moorfield's value, the income from investments, the security the inheritance represented. "I had a temporary setback last month," James mentioned at one point, almost as an aside. "Nothing serious, but I had to borrow a small sum from my club. These things happen, of course." "What sort of setback?" Charlotte asked. "Oh, just an investment that didn't pan out as expected." He changed the subject quickly. "But tell me, have you given thought to how you'll manage such an estate? It must be daunting for someone without experience." Charlotte felt a chill settle over her. He wasn't interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her life. He was interested in her assets, cataloguing them like an auctioneer pricing goods. Yet beneath her growing suspicion, she felt an uncomfortable pity. James seemed genuinely lonely, genuinely lost, just desperately calculating about it. "I should go," he said finally, rising. "But might I see you again? Perhaps I could call Sunday afternoon?" "I'll send word if I'm available," Charlotte said, deliberately non-committal. After he left, Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway, her expression eloquent. "Not one word, Agnes. I wasn't going to say anything, miss, except that man has the look of someone sizing up property to purchase." 3 days later, Alexander arrived in a simple carriage, dressed for the country rather than society. "I thought you might like to see some of the innovations we've implemented on the estate," he said. "If you're to manage Moorfield properly, you should understand modern agricultural practices." The contrast to James's visit struck Charlotte immediately. Alexander spoke to her as an equal, assuming her intelligence and interest rather than her need for male guidance. They drove to one of Hawthorne Park's tenant farms, where Alexander explained crop rotation, drainage improvements, and the new machinery he'd purchased to ease his tenants' labor. "Productive tenants are profitable tenants," he said. "But more than that, these are families who've worked this land for generations. They deserve to be treated with dignity." At Farmer Morrison's cottage, they met the elderly farmer and his daughter, Sarah, heavily pregnant and recently widowed. "Your Grace." Morrison bowed, but Alexander waved the formality away. "How are you managing, Sarah?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "Better, thanks to your generosity, Your Grace. I don't know what we'd have done without the cottage and the allowance you've provided." After they left, Charlotte turned to Alexander. "You're letting her stay rent-free? Until after the child is born and she's back on her feet." He sounded almost defensive. "It's merely good estate management. Losing a tenant due to temporary hardship is poor economics." "No," Charlotte said firmly. "It's compassion dressed as practicality. You needn't pretend otherwise with me." Alexander's expression softened. "Helena used to say the same thing, that I hid behind duty and economics when I was simply uncomfortable accepting praise for basic decency." They walked back through autumn woods, leaves crunching beneath their feet. The afternoon light slanted golden through bare branches, creating a cathedral of shadow and illumination. "Tell me about your life before all this," Alexander said suddenly. "Not the facts Mr. Pemberton outlined, but the truth. What did you want? What did you dream about?" The question surprised Charlotte into honesty. "I wanted to matter, to be seen as something other than a burden or an obligation. I spent years watching life from windows, convincing myself that observation was enough, that I didn't need participation. But it was a lie I told myself to make invisibility bearable." "I understand that." Alexander's voice was quiet. "I've also been watching life rather than living it. Duty is an excellent hiding place. Society expects dukes to be remote, controlled, focused on legacy and obligation. It's easy to disappear behind those expectations. What would you do if duty didn't define you?" He was silent for so long Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I'd risk more, feel more, care less about appearances and more about authenticity. He stopped walking, turned to face her. "I'd allow myself to want things I've convinced myself are inappropriate or impossible." Their eyes met. Charlotte's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. Alexander's hand lifted slightly, as though reaching for hers, then stopped. His jaw tightened as he mastered whatever impulse had moved him. "We should return," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It's getting late." They walked in silence, but it was a different silence now charged with things unsaid. At Hawthorne Park, Alexander's housekeeper intercepted them in the entrance hall. "Your Grace, a gentleman called this morning asking after Miss Kingsley. A Mr. Westwood." He wished to know when she might return from her outing. Alexander's expression darkened for just a moment before smoothing to neutrality. How thoughtful of him to inquire. That evening, a note arrived at Moorfield. "Miss Kingsley, forgive my presumption, but I must speak with you on a matter of some urgency. Might I call tomorrow afternoon? Your devoted servant, James Westwood." Charlotte held the note, comparing the afternoon's two visits in her mind. James, with his flowers and flattery, his careful mentions of money, troubles, his interest in her inheritance over her person. Alexander, with his tenant farmers and unguarded conversations, his compassion disguised as practicality, his hands almost reaching for hers before duty intervened. One man saw her as a solution. The other saw her as a person worth knowing. The comparison did not favor James Westwood, and yet Charlotte found herself agreeing to see him again, driven by some combination of pity, curiosity, and the nagging question, what if she was being unfair? What if James's interest in her finances was simply the practical concern of a man who'd learned hard lessons about security? What if she was comparing him to Alexander not fairly, but through the lens of her own growing and completely inappropriate feelings for a duke who was merely fulfilling a duty to a dead friend? Charlotte folded James's note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Tomorrow she would see him again. She would be fair, objective, open to the possibility of second chances. But tonight, alone in her room, it was Alexander's face she saw, Alexander's voice she heard, Alexander's almost touch she felt, and she knew, with uncomfortable certainty, that her heart was making choices her mind hadn't yet acknowledged. Dangerous choices, impossible choices, choices that would complicate everything. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The private parlour at the Lamb Inn was respectably shabby, worn carpet, faded wallpaper, but clean and properly maintained. Charlotte sat stiffly on a horsehair settee, Mrs. Davies positioned by the window with her perpetual needlework. When James entered, Charlotte barely recognized him. His cravat sat askew, imperfectly tied. Shadows pooled beneath his eyes like bruises. His clothes, while clean, bore the wrinkled appearance of someone who dressed hastily or slept in them. The polished charm he'd worn like armor at their previous meetings had cracked, revealing something desperate beneath. "Miss Kingsley, Charlotte, thank you for coming." He sat without asking permission, leaning forward with urgent intensity. "I must speak plainly. I have found myself in difficult circumstances." Charlotte's spine straightened. "What circumstances?" "Financial embarrassment. Temporary, I assure you, but pressing." The words tumbled out quickly. "Some unfortunate investments. Nothing scandalous, simply poor timing. But my creditors are becoming insistent. I wondered if you might lend me £200, just until my expectations come through." The room seemed to tilt. Charlotte gripped her reticule, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "Mr. Westwood, you cannot be serious. We are barely reacquainted, and you're asking me for money. I know how it sounds." James ran a hand through his hair, destroying what remained of his careful grooming. "But Charlotte, if we're to have any future together, we must be honest about these matters. £200 is nothing compared to what you've inherited. Surely, we have no future together, Mr. Westwood." He stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "Don't you see? We could be perfect for each other. You need to marry within, 4 months now? And you need someone who understands estate management, financial matters. I made mistakes with Millicent's fortune, yes, but I've learned from them. Together we could manage Helena's inheritance properly." "You are not proposing marriage," Charlotte said coldly. "You are proposing a business arrangement." "What's marriage but a business arrangement?" James's mask slipped further, revealing something harder beneath the charm. "At least I'm being honest about it, unlike some people." "What does that mean?" "The Duke." James's tone turned bitter. "You think his interest in you is personal? He's merely fulfilling an obligation to your aunt, parading you before society like a horse at auction, spending time with you out of duty. When this is over, he'll return to his duchesses in waiting and his parliamentary concerns. Men like Hawthorne don't marry women like you, no offense intended." Each word was calculated to wound, and several struck home. But Charlotte had spent 8 years learning to control her expression. "This meeting is over, Mr. Westwood." "Charlotte, please. It's Miss Kingsley, and you will not contact me again." She left with Mrs. Davies, refusing to look back, refusing to let James see how his words had shaken her. 2 days later, Mrs. Davies appeared in Charlotte's study with the expression she wore when delivering particularly unpleasant truths. "I've made inquiries, miss, about Mr. Westwood." Charlotte set down her pen. "And? He has debts throughout the county. Tradesmen, landlords, even his club. My cousin's husband works at the Silver Swan in Derby, a gambling establishment of poor reputation. He says Mr. Westwood is there most evenings, losing money he doesn't have." Charlotte's hands tightened on the desk edge. She'd suspected, but confirmation still stung, not because she'd hoped for anything from James, but because she'd been targeted, assessed, pursued not for herself, but for what she represented. "I need to see this for myself." Mrs. Davies nodded grimly. "I thought you might. I've already arranged for appropriate clothing. We'll go as tradeswomen invisible to quality folk." The Silver Swan occupied a narrow building on a shabby Derby street, its windows lit despite the late hour. Charlotte and Mrs. Davies, wearing plain dresses and shawls borrowed from Moorfield's servants, stood in the shadows across the street. They didn't wait long. James arrived just past 9 o'clock, entering with the furtive determination of an addict, seeking his particular poison. Through the grimy windows, Charlotte caught glimpses of green baize tables, cigar smoke, men hunched over cards and dice. 3 hours passed. Charlotte remained, compelled by some need to understand fully what James had become. When he finally emerged past midnight, she barely recognized him. His face was haggard, devastated. He stopped on the street, swaying slightly, and kicked viciously at a stone post once, twice, 3 times before staggering away into darkness. Charlotte felt pity rise like bile in her throat. Not the pity that excuses, but the terrible compassion for witnessing someone's self-destruction. "He's drowning," she whispered, "and he thought I might be a rope." "You're not responsible for saving him, miss," Mrs. Davies said gently. "Some people can only be saved by themselves." On November 10th, Charlotte sent a brief note. "Mr. Westwood, I will receive you at Moorfield House tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Come, prepared to speak truthfully." He arrived defensive, the charm reassembled but transparent now. "Miss Kingsley, I apologize for my behavior at the Lamb. I was overwrought. I will not debate the truth with you, Mr. Westwood." Charlotte remained standing, refusing to offer him the comfort of hospitality. "I know about your debts. I know about the Silver Swan. I want to understand only one thing. Was any of it real? When you approached me at the ball, when you spoke of regret and second chances, was any of it genuine?" For a long moment, James stood frozen. Then something collapsed inside him. He sank into a chair uninvited, his face in his hands. "The gambling began during my marriage to Millicent. She knew I'd married her for money. I knew she'd married me to spite another suitor. We made each other miserable. The tables were escape the only place where my choices mattered, where I might win something through my own actions." "How much do you owe?" "Over £3,000. His voice was hollow. "Ruinous debts. I'll be in debtor's prison by spring if I can't pay." "And I was what? Your solution?" James looked up, and Charlotte saw genuine shame in his face. "When I heard about your inheritance, I convinced myself it was fate. A second chance. I thought if I could marry you, I could pay my debts, start fresh. And I told myself I could make you happy, that it wouldn't be entirely mercenary. Did you ever love me, James? 8 years ago?" He was silent so long Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "I loved the idea of you. Someone kind, intelligent, who might save me from myself. But Charlotte," he used her name without permission now, too broken for pretense, "I've never been capable of loving anyone more than I love the thrill of the next wager. Not you, not Millicent, not even my daughter, who died before I could hold her." The confession was devastating in its honesty. "Then you must save yourself," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "I cannot do it for you. I will not marry you. I will not lend you money. Our acquaintance ends here, Mr. Westwood, but I wish you well. I hope you find the courage to stop running from yourself." James stood slowly, oddly dignified in his defeat. "You deserve better than me. You always did." He paused at the door. "The Duke, his interest isn't obligation. I was cruel to suggest it. I've seen how he looks at you, like you're something precious he's afraid to break." Then he was gone. Charlotte sank onto the settee, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had drained something essential from her, not hope for James, but perhaps some lingering innocence about human nature. She was still sitting there when Mrs. Davies entered, followed immediately by Alexander. He looked disheveled, unusual for him, his cravat loosened, his expression tight with concern. "I heard Westwood was here. Are you hurt? Did he—" "I'm fine." Charlotte managed a weak smile. "Your spy network is impressive. My head groom's brother works in your stables." He was concerned. Alexander dismissed the servants with a gesture and sat beside her, maintaining proper distance but close enough that she could feel his warmth. What happened? Charlotte told him everything: the meeting at the inn, the gambling den, the final confrontation. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression growing darker. "I should be relieved you refused him," he said when she finished. His voice was carefully controlled, but something burned beneath the surface. "I am relieved. But Charlotte, Miss Kingsley, my relief is not primarily in my capacity as executor." Charlotte's breath stopped. The air between them suddenly felt charged, dangerous. Alexander seemed to realize what he'd said. He stood abruptly, color rising in his face. "I should not have spoken. Please forgive me. That was inappropriate. And, Alexander, I should go. You've had a difficult morning. I'll call tomorrow to—" He left before she could form a response, his departure so hasty it bordered on flight. Charlotte sat in the empty drawing room, her heart hammering. James Westwood forgotten entirely. Alexander's carefully controlled mask had cracked, and she'd glimpsed what lay beneath. Something that looked remarkably like longing. Something that mirrored the feelings she'd been trying desperately to ignore. 4 months remained. 4 months to find a suitable match and satisfy Helena's condition. But Charlotte's heart had already made its choice, whether her mind acknowledged it or not. And that choice complicated everything. Chapter 8. Walls Come Down. The note arrived with Alexander's seal pressed into deep blue wax, the handwriting precisely formal. "Miss Kingsley, I would be grateful if you might call at Hawthorne Park this afternoon on a matter concerning the estate. 2 o'clock, if convenient. Yours, Hawthorne, not Alexander. Hawthorne, the Duke, not the man." Charlotte held the note, her hands trembling slightly. 2 days had passed since his abrupt departure, since those carefully spoken words that had hung in the air like smoke. "My relief is not primarily in my capacity as executor." She'd replayed that moment constantly, the look on his face, the way he'd fled rather than elaborate, the sudden crack in his careful composure. Now he wanted to see her on a matter concerning the estate. Business. Safe, formal, controlled. Charlotte dressed with unusual care, choosing a deep green day dress that Mrs. Davies assured her was becoming. She told herself it was simple propriety. She knew she was lying. Alexander met her in his study, not the conservatory. That felt significant. The study was formal, professional, while the conservatory was where they'd first connected over orchids and Darwin. He looked as though he hadn't slept. His cravat was perfect, his clothing impeccable, but shadows pooled beneath his grey eyes, and his jaw was tight with tension. "Miss Kingsley, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, maintaining the barrier of polished mahogany between them. "There's a document regarding Moorfield's timber rights that requires your signature. A formality, really, but necessary for the estate records." Charlotte sat. Alexander produced papers, explained provisions in a voice carefully devoid of emotion. She signed where indicated. The whole transaction took perhaps 5 minutes. Then silence, thick, awkward, waited with everything unsaid. Charlotte set down the pen with deliberate care. "Your Grace, you said something 2 days ago that we have not addressed." Alexander's shoulders tensed. "I spoke improperly. You were in distress over Westwood. I ask you to disregard it." "What if I cannot?" His eyes snapped to hers, something desperate and hungry flickering across his face before he mastered it. "Charlotte, what did you mean? That your relief wasn't primarily in your capacity as executor?" Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window, putting distance between them. For a long moment he said nothing, his back to her, every line of his body rigid with control. "I have been dishonest with you," he said finally, his voice low. "Not in word, but in omission. What have you omitted?" He turned to face her, and Charlotte saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, raw vulnerability, the careful mask finally abandoned. "I didn't meet you for the first time when you came to my conservatory. I've known who you were for 5 years. Charlotte's breath caught. 5 years? There was a lecture at the Royal Society, Natural Philosophy Wallace presenting on biogeography. You attended with your father, shortly before his death. Charlotte remembered. One of the last outings with her father before illness confined him to bed. She'd asked the lecturer a question about species distribution that had earned approving nods from the assembled scientists. You were there. I noticed you immediately, Alexander's voice roughened. A young woman with an unfashionable amount of intelligence visible in her face. You asked your question with such precision, such obvious understanding. Most women at those lectures are ornamental, accompanying husbands or fathers, but not truly engaged. You were different, present, alive in a way that made everyone else seem half asleep. He moved closer, still maintaining distance but closing the gap slightly. I was engaged to Lady Cecilia then, but I watched you that day, watched how you seemed both fully present and somehow apart, how you retreated after your question was answered, as though you'd revealed too much and needed to hide again. I don't remember seeing you. You wouldn't have. I was careful not to be noticed, but over the next 5 years, I saw you occasionally, at lectures, in bookshops, at museums, always alone, growing increasingly isolated. His voice dropped, growing more invisible. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. Why didn't you speak to me? Because I convinced myself I was too damaged by duty and loss to deserve happiness. My father died when I was 7, thrown from a horse. My mother when I was 24, fever. Cecilia before our wedding. I felt relief at that last loss, Charlotte. Relief. What kind of man feels relief at his betrothed's death? A man who was honest with himself about his feelings, or a man too cowardly to admit the truth before tragedy did it for him? Alexander ran a hand through his hair, destroying its careful arrangement. I learned to feel nothing because feeling leads to loss. Duty became my hiding place, the perfect excuse to remain distant, controlled, safe. He moved closer still, close enough that Charlotte could see the muscle working in his jaw. Then Helena summoned me. She was dying, and she told me about you. She said, I watched my niece disappear the way I disappeared. Stop her, Alexander. If you cannot save yourself, save her. So you accepted the executor role. I accepted it specifically to be near you, to protect you, even if it meant watching you choose another man, even if it meant ensuring that other man treated you well while my heart... He stopped, breathed hard. When Westwood appeared, I told myself, if you loved him, I would facilitate it. But I have been in agony, Charlotte. The thought of you with him, with anyone. Why didn't you speak to me 5 years ago? Charlotte stood, moving toward him. Why watch from a distance? Because I am a coward dressed as a duke. Alexander's laugh was bitter. I hide behind duty because vulnerability terrifies me. I lost everyone I loved. I learned to armor myself in obligation and call it nobility. But it was fear. Simple, devastating fear. Charlotte's own walls were crumbling. She'd spent so long protecting herself, convincing herself that isolation was choice rather than wound. I have spent 10 years convincing myself I don't want to be seen, she said, her voice breaking. That invisibility is safety. That if I retreat far enough, I won't risk the pain of rejection. But Alexander, you see me. You've seen me from the beginning. And I... She stopped, terrified of the words. You what? His voice was barely a whisper. I have been falling in love with you while telling myself it was impossible, that you were simply fulfilling an obligation to a dead woman, that a duke could never truly want someone like me. Nothing about my feelings for you is obligation. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, trembling slightly. I love you, Charlotte. I have loved you for 5 years, from a coward's distance. I love your mind, your strength, your stubborn refusal to compromise yourself. I love the way you challenge me, the way you see through my pretenses, the way you make me want to be brave. I'm terrified, Charlotte whispered. So am I. What if we fail? What if... He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, years of restraint shattering at once. Charlotte's hands fisted in his jacket, pulling him closer. Alexander's arms wrapped around her waist, holding her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Charlotte's carefully pinned hair had come loose, and Alexander's cravat was hopelessly askew. I am terrified, Charlotte said again, her forehead resting against his. But I'm more terrified of living another day, as half a person. We can be terrified together. They moved to the conservatory by unspoken agreement, settling on the bench beneath the orchids. Alexander kept her hand in his, as though afraid she'd vanish. I have 3 months left, Charlotte said. If I marry you, people will say I chose wealth and title. They will say that regardless. The question is, what do you want? Charlotte looked at their joined hands, her small fingers intertwined with his longer ones. I want a partner, someone who sees marriage as a meeting of equals, not a transaction or a duty. Then that is what we will build. Alexander's voice was fierce with conviction. Your fortune remains yours. I'll have it legally protected. Your interests, your independence, your voice in all matters, these are not negotiable. I don't want a decorative wife. I want you, Charlotte. Fully yourself. Always. People will think, let them think what they wish. I spent 5 years caring too much about appearances, about duty, about what was proper. It brought me nothing but loneliness. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I'm done hiding behind obligation. So am I. They sat in silence, but it was comfortable now, the silence of two people who'd finally stopped running from truth. What happens now? Charlotte asked. Now I court you properly, call on you at Moorfield, take you driving. Let society see us together. Alexander smiled, and Charlotte realized it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, unguarded, transforming his austere features into something almost boyish. And you decide, freely and without pressure, if you can imagine a life with a duke who's terrified of orchids dying and writes terrible poetry he never shows anyone. You write poetry. His ears reddened. Absolutely terrible poetry. Helena mocked me mercilessly. Charlotte laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that surprised them both. I want to read it. Absolutely not. That's a privilege reserved for marriage. Then I suppose I'll have to marry you. The words hung in the air, half jest and half promise. Alexander's expression sobered. Is that what you want? Truly? Charlotte thought of Helena's journals. 30 years of regret. 30 years wondering, what if? She thought of James, drowning in his own weakness, grasping for salvation he could only find within himself. She thought of the woman she'd been invisible, resigned, watching life from windows. And she looked at Alexander, flawed, frightened, but brave enough to be vulnerable, to risk rejection, to admit 5 years of silent longing. Yes, she said simply. That's what I want. Truly. Alexander kissed her again, gently this time, reverently, as though sealing a vow. Outside the conservatory windows, November wind stripped the last leaves from the trees. Inside, surrounded by green growing things, two people who'd spent years hiding finally chose to be seen. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was, Charlotte thought as Alexander's arms tightened around her, finally living rather than merely existing, and that made all the fear worthwhile. Chapter 9. Choosing Love. 6 weeks had transformed everything and nothing. Charlotte still lived at Moorfield House. Alexander still resided primarily at Hawthorne Park. But the careful distance they'd maintained had collapsed into something warmer, more real. They walked through winter gardens, debating Darwin and discussing poetry. Alexander taught Charlotte estate management, crop rotations, tenant relations, investment strategies. Charlotte challenged his assumptions about everything from parliamentary reform to the proper way to propagate orchids. They learned to be vulnerable, to admit fear, to exist without armor. Mrs. Davies watched their courtship with evident satisfaction. He looks at you the way my Tom looked at his orchids, she told Charlotte one afternoon. Like something precious he cannot quite believe is real. On the morning of December 20th, with 2 months and 25 days remaining on Helena's deadline, Charlotte received an unexpected visitor. James Westwood stood in Moorfield's entrance hall, thinner than she remembered. Shadows still beneath his eyes, but something different in his bearing, steadier, perhaps, or simply more honest. Miss Kingsley, thank you for seeing me. I promise not to take much of your time. Charlotte led him to the drawing room, keeping the door open. Mrs. Davies positioned herself strategically in the hallway. I'm leaving for the continent, James said without preamble. My brother has agreed to pay my passage and debts, all of them, if I accept a position in his shipping company in Boston. I sail next week. I'm glad for you, Mr. Westwood. I came to apologize, properly, this time, not with excuses or justifications, but simply to say I'm sorry for how I treated you 8 years ago, for how I approached you this autumn, for seeing you as a solution rather than a person. Charlotte studied him. The charm had been stripped away, leaving something more genuine beneath. I accept your apology. And to thank you. Thank me? James smiled a real smile, sad but authentic. You refused to save me. It was the kindest thing anyone has done. If you had married me out of pity, I would have destroyed us both. Instead, you forced me to face myself. He paused. I've begun attending meetings with others, afflicted with gambling compulsion. Dr. Morrison in Derby runs them. I'm trying to rebuild myself, Miss Kingsley. Actually rebuild, not just rearrange the ruins. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. I wish you well, James, truly. You deserve happiness. He moved toward the door, then turned back. The Duke, he loves you, you know. I see it in how he looks at you. The way I looked at the gaming tables, perhaps, but his addiction is far healthier than mine. After he left, Charlotte stood at the window, watching his carriage disappear down the drive. Old wounds, finally closed. A chapter ended with grace instead of bitterness. She turned to find Alexander in the doorway, concern evident on his face. He came to say goodbye, Charlotte said, and to thank me for refusing him. Alexander crossed the room, pulled her into his arms. Are you well? I am. Charlotte leaned into his warmth. I'm ready, Alexander. Let's go to London. Let's finish this. 3 days later, Charlotte and Alexander stood outside Mr. Pemberton's office in Gray's Inn. Snow had begun to fall, dusting London's streets with white. Are you certain? Charlotte asked, gripping Alexander's hand. You could have any woman in England, someone younger, more beautiful, more... Charlotte. Alexander turned her to face him, his grey eyes intense. I do not want any woman in England. I want the woman who challenges me to be better, who shares my love of terrible puns about botany, who is brave enough to let herself be known. He cupped her face in his hands. I want you. Only you. Always you. Inside, Mr. Pemberton greeted them with his characteristic precision. Your Grace, Miss Kingsley. I understand congratulations are in order. We wish to marry, Charlotte said. I've decided to marry Duke Alexander Hawthorne. Pemberton's austere expression softened into something approaching a smile. Your aunt would be pleased. He reached into his desk, withdrew a sealed envelope. Before we proceed with the marriage settlements, there is a codicil to your aunt's will that I was instructed to reveal only at this moment. Charlotte felt Alexander tense beside her. A codicil? Dated the week before your aunt's death. She was quite specific about when it should be disclosed. Pemberton broke the seal, read aloud. Should my niece, Charlotte Kingsley, freely choose to marry for genuine affection, as verified by the testimony of the executor, Duke Alexander Hawthorne, she shall inherit regardless of the 6-month constraint. The timeline was never meant to create pressure, but to create urgency, to force her to live rather than merely exist. If she chooses not to marry, the full inheritance is hers after the 6 months expire. I will not control her from the grave. I only wish to wake her from sleep. H.K. The room tilted. Charlotte gripped the edge of Pemberton's desk. I was never at risk of losing it? Not if you chose authentically. His Grace held the power to verify that your choice was genuine at any point. The inheritance was always yours, Miss Kingsley. Your aunt was testing whether you would choose love over fear, not whether you would marry at all. Charlotte turned slowly to Alexander. You knew. His face was pale but steady. Helena told me everything before she died. She made me swear not to tell you. She said your choice had to be free, unmanipulated by knowledge of safety. Every moment of our courtship, every moment, I knew you couldn't lose the inheritance, and I knew that if you chose me, you would believe you were risking everything. Alexander's voice roughened. If you had chosen James, I would have had to let you go, knowing the inheritance would remain yours but unable to tell you. It was torture, Charlotte. Watching you face that choice, believing the stakes were higher than they were. Charlotte stared at him, processing. Then, unexpectedly, she began to laugh, a sound somewhere between tears and joy. My aunt was brilliant and utterly devious. She turned to Alexander, took both his hands. I chose you, believing I might lose everything. That doesn't change now that I know I wouldn't have. My choice remains, Alexander. It was never about the inheritance. It was about you. Alexander pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. I love you. I know. I've known since the conservatory, since the orchids. Charlotte smiled through tears. Let's get married. January 15th, 1876, dawned cold and bright over Derbyshire. The village church near Moorfield was small, intimate, filled with winter light, streaming through plain glass windows. Mrs. Davies sat in the front pew beside Mr. Pemberton, both looking uncharacteristically emotional. Local tenants filled the remaining seats, people who'd known Helena, who welcomed Charlotte as her rightful heir. Charlotte wore cream silk, simple and elegant, with lace from Helena's wedding dress never worn, saved for 3 decades, incorporated into the sleeves. Alexander stood at the altar in formal black, his expression when she entered a mixture of awe and fierce joy. The vows they'd written together emphasized partnership over hierarchy, intellectual companionship over duty, chosen family over obligation. When the vicar asked if Alexander took Charlotte as his wife, his voice broke slightly on, "I do." Charlotte's remained steady. She'd spent 10 years learning to hide her feelings. Now, finally, she let them show. "I do." Evening settled over Moorfield's winter garden as Charlotte and Alexander walked hand in hand through frost-touched pathways. Helena's grave was simple, a stone Charlotte had commissioned, inscribed with words that felt true. Helena Margaret Kingsley, 1819 to 1875. She chose courage too late, but not too late to matter. Charlotte placed winter roses at the base, their red vivid against white snow. "Thank you, Aunt Helena," she said aloud, "for seeing me, for saving me," Alexander added quietly, "and for trusting me to protect her choice." They turned toward the garden folly, a small structure Helena had loved, now filled with snow. On the bench inside, weighted down by a stone, was an envelope addressed in familiar handwriting, "Charlotte and Alexander." Charlotte's hands trembled as she opened it. "My dear children, for so I think of you both. If you are reading this together, I have succeeded in the only thing that mattered at the end of my life. Charlotte, you were never a spinster. That label was society's failure, not yours. You were simply waiting for a life worth living, a love worth choosing. You have my spirit, child, but thank heavens, you have more courage. You chose what I could not. Alexander, you were never too damaged for happiness. You were simply waiting for someone brave enough to see past your armor to the good man beneath. Duty made you a duke. Love will make you whole. Love each other well. Live the life I could not. Argue about botany and philosophy. Let each other be fully yourselves. Build something better than the loneliness I chose. And know that in my last days, when pain was my constant companion, the thought of your future happiness was my greatest comfort. You have given an old woman's regrets a purpose. Thank you. H. Charlotte wept openly. Alexander's arm tightened around her shoulders, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. They stood together in the gathering dusk, two people who'd spent years hiding from life, from feeling, from the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known. Helena had given them money, property, security. But more than that, she'd given them permission. Permission to choose love over fear, to risk heartbreak for the chance at wholeness, to believe they deserved happiness. "Come," Alexander said finally. "Mrs. Davies is preparing supper. She'll scold us for catching cold." They walked back toward Moorfield House, lights glowing warm in every window. Through the glass, Charlotte could see Agnes moving through the kitchen, humming to herself. Home, not the house she'd inherited, but the life she'd chosen. The partnership she'd built with a man who saw her fully and loved her anyway. The courage to be vulnerable, to be seen, to stop watching life from windows and step into it instead. At 30, society had called her a spinster, a woman past her prime, without prospects, relegated to the margins. At 30, Charlotte had discovered she'd simply been waiting, not for rescue, but for readiness, not for someone to complete her, but for someone who'd challenge her to be more fully herself. She'd been called a spinster. She'd chosen to be a wife, a partner, a woman who refused to compromise her worth for anyone's comfort, including her own. As they crossed the threshold into warmth and light and chosen family, Charlotte looked back once at the darkening garden where Helena rested. "I chose courage," she whispered, "finally." And in the winter wind, she could have sworn she heard her aunt's approving laughter. And so, Charlotte Kingsley, once called a spinster at 30, discovered that the best chapters of her life were still unwritten. She learned that it's never too late to choose courage over fear, love over loneliness, and authenticity over society's narrow expectations. If Charlotte's journey resonated with you, if you believe that true love requires vulnerability, that it's never too late to rewrite your story, or that sometimes the inheritance we need most isn't money but permission to be brave, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you these stories of courage, second chances, and love that refuses to compromise. Subscribe to Lyra's romance stories for more historical romances where heroines choose themselves first and love finds them because of it, not despite it. And if you know someone who needs to hear Charlotte's story, someone who's been told they're too late or past their prime, someone who's watching life from windows instead of living it, share this with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that our best chapters might still be ahead. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you choose, safety or the courage to be fully seen? I read every comment and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember, you are never too late, you are never too much, and you are always, always worth choosing.